I want to get right in by talking about the state of healthcare in Texas as a microcosm. Really, we have a healthcare policy question with many facets to it that moves up to the federal level. But of course, all of us in this room are focused on Texas, as I know you are for a lot of the time. The U.S. Census about 3 weeks ago put out a report that said that we now have 5.8 million uninsured Texans, 23% of our population. We are first among the states in terms of the percentage of our citizens who are uninsured. The percentage is actually down. I think it used to be 27%. Now it's 23%. But we are first among the states in the percentage of uninsured Texans. You are a congressman responsible for so much health policy work. You're a doctor, so you're in the best position to answer this question. Is that something that we should be concerned about in an immediate sense, that we have so many people in this state who are uninsured?
Well, the short answer is yes, and you do have to ask yourself, why in the world is it like that? And of course, the answer is multifactorial. And we are the state with the largest continuous border with our southern neighbor. And I don't think there's any question that that affects things.
In what respect? Let me stop you. In what respect?
Well, let me just give you an example. When I mean, it's very famous that Massachusetts has took a bold step in healthcare, and one of their folks came down to Congress to talk about that when it was happening in 2006 or 2007. And I said, well, what is your approach to people in the state who don't have a Social Security number? And they said, well, why would anyone be in your state without a Social Security number? I said, well, I can think of a reason, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 million, and that is the problem. They said, we have ignored that. If there is such a population in Massachusetts, we've ignored it. Well, you can't ignore it in Texas, because that is the problem, right? I mean, that's a huge part of the problem.
Do you know what percentage of those 5.8 million people counted by the census as uninsured or undocumented? I assume you're talking about undocumented persons.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that, but you could not construct a system where you just said, we're not going to worry about that portion of the population. So that's an issue that has to be addressed. And so, you know, when we've talked about healthcare reform on the national basis, and the president says, well, I like what they did in Massachusetts, I want to apply it to everyone. Well, I knew right away it wasn't going to work in Texas, because in Massachusetts they had ignored what I would consider is probably one of the largest problems we have with our uninsured population. Now, in Texas, we do have a pretty robust safety net system. I mean, I know I worked at Parkland Hospital for 4 years in private practice. Probably 20 to 25% of the deliveries I did every month were from people I'd never seen before and would never see again. But we always took care of people. We never turned anyone away, and we were just a small privately owned community hospital. And I suspect that story is replicated in small community hospitals all over the state on a nightly basis. And of course, in our larger institutions who do receive federal monies from the so-called disproportionate share fund and the upper payment limit, or whatever it is, the UPL funds, I mean, they actually have a revenue stream that they can depend upon to take care of that portion of the population. Then one of the I brought with me, in case anyone wants to read it, a copy of the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act as signed into law in March 23rd of 2010. One of the ways that this thing gets paid for is recapturing that money from hospitals that receive disproportionate share funds. That is to say, everybody's going to have insurance, so why do they need that extra money? Because everybody comes to the door now, has insurance, and so no one's uninsured, and the hospitals no longer need this special attention from these federal funds, so we can take it back. And they do, in fact, and I forget the year, but it's 2015 or 2016 where those, if there's any hospital folks in the room, they can correct me on this, but it's coming in fairly short order where those dollars are going to be brought back and used for something different. Well, except that the President of the United States in September of 2009 stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and said that no one who's in the country without the benefit of a Social Security number is going to receive any of the benefits under the Affordable Care Act. And you may remember he got into a little bit of a debate, pretty brief, with Joe Wilson in South Carolina. Remember that night?
It ended with the phrase "you lie," isn't that right?
But that was the point. I mean, the president said no one who's in the country without the benefit of Social Security number is going to participate in the program. So, okay, John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas, they're going to lose their disproportionate share funds. Everybody's going to have insurance, except that portion of the population who lacks citizenship.
So your problem, Congressman, to begin, because you do have a problem with the Affordable Care Act, and you have been consistent from the very beginning since this was first introduced, when it was passed, despite the fact that it's now been found through a vaguely circuitous route to be constitutional by the Supreme Court.
Kind to acknowledge
you have been, but it is constitutional. I mean, it's sort of like being a little pregnant. It's constitutional.
No, it's like being a little dead, actually.
Well, but the point is that through all of this, you have asserted that you are opposed to this deal. I want to say that here in Houston at Rice University at the Hobby Center, Steve Murdoch, who was the former state demographer, former U.S. Census Bureau director, and his colleague, Dr. Klein, put out a report a couple of weeks ago that said that if Texas would only embrace aspects of the Affordable Care Act, now that it's constitutional, we could cut the number of uninsured Texans from 5.8 million to 2.8 million by 2014. So the question I have for you is, are the problems you have with the Affordable Care Act so great that you would rather see it go away than see 3 million additional Texans insured by 2014?
Well, no, it's not that you don't want anything there. And in fact, there were a number of things that were being worked on when the Affordable Care Act came along. But obviously, it knocked all of those things off the playing field because it was so large and so all-encompassing that nothing else was considered. Sure, there are plenty of things that could be done. A lot of the problems that existed, and Texas, as other states, were problems that existed in the small group market and the individual market. The large group market didn't have a lot of those problems. Now, the biggest problem that all of us had was cost, and nothing in this
addresses cost adequately.
Helps cost. Right. In fact, it's made it worse. And that's Governor Romney's famous line that you promised a $2,500 reduction in premiums, but it actually went $2,500 the other way. It's a $5,000 swing, which is going to affect families in a big way. So rather than tackle the number one conundrum that was facing everyone, which is cost, the president, the administration decided to go for coverage first. And even that, when this thing is fully implemented, you're still going to have 27 million people uninsured in this country. I mean, it's still a big chunk.
So
Texas is likely to have the lion's share of that.
The cost issue is your biggest problem. I mean, it's hard to say what are your issues in brief because this is a big piece of legislation. There's probably a very complex conversation we can have, but to the degree that it can be in brief, cost is your first big problem with it. What are your second and third big problems with it?
Remember when Justice Kennedy, I was fortunate enough to sit in the Supreme Court on the second day when they did the oral arguments on the constitutionality of the individual mandate. And it was like everybody else. I mean, I'd watched all the pundits. I knew there were 4 justices on the left and 4 on the right. One guy, there was one vote that was going to matter in the Affordable Care Act, and that was Justice Kennedy. So the Solicitor General gets maybe 60 seconds into his presentation to the court, and Justice Kennedy interrupts him and says, wait a minute, does this not fundamentally change the relationship of the government with those that it purports to govern? And I mean, I was like ready to stand up on the pew and cheer, except there was a big guy who said, you can't do that.
Cheer.
No, you can't do anything. You can't even flinch while you're in there. But then another 60 seconds goes by, and the Solicitor General continues, and he says, and if we are going to change that fundamental nature between the government and those it purports to govern, should that not require a very high bar to be crossed before we make such a change? So here's the deal. I mean, it is a big change in the relationship that we have with our federal government.
So there's a cost issue and there's a constitutional issue.
Not so at the state level, and that's why states, I mean, look, you have Governor Herbert in Utah, who's a Republican governor who was working as hard as he could to set up a state exchange in his state. And, of course, he got thrown off kilter by this thing coming through, and now he doesn't know where he is. I complained a lot when this thing was happening in 2009, 2010, because none of the doctors who were in Congress were included in any of these discussions. None of the doctors in the country really were included in many of these discussions. Governor Herbert, Governor Huckabee formerly of Arkansas, they're upset because no governors were included. And governors really have a lot of the jurisdiction of health care in their states on their desks every day. They've got their state Medicaid program, they've got their state prisons, they've got their employee programs for the state insurance. These are folks who know health care, deeply know health care.
And they were not included.
And they were said, you're irrelevant in this discussion.
Right.
We're going to do it at the federal level. And every state, just as I pointed out the difference between Massachusetts and Texas in 2006 or 2007, and the same is replicated with states all over the country. Governor Herbert says, okay, let's do exchanges. Governor Perry's probably not going to make a statement like that.
Not inclined, right, yeah. So cost and these other issues, basically there's some substance and some process that get you to the place where, or have gotten you previously to the place where you oppose this and still oppose it. So let's assume that Mitt Romney wins in November. And so now we got a Republican president. You all retain control of the House, regardless of whether you win the Senate back. You're going to press on with an attempt to repeal this, to overturn it, to kill it in the cradle, whatever you can do.
Well, we're pretty far past the cradle at this point. But Governor Romney has stated that that will be one of his first objectives, is to alter the course of history with this thing. And I think that's the right approach to take. If there is a Romney administration and Republicans win as many as 50 seats in the Senate, Paul Ryan is the president of the Senate, and the new vice president would be the tiebreaker.
No guarantee from this vantage point, but it still could happen.
Yeah, if that is a scenario that unfolds after November 6th and then on into the inauguration day, then there is a possibility. Because remember, a lot of this was allowed to pass. Can I take you back for just a minute to Christmas Eve of 2009? Do you remember Christmas Eve of 2009? It was a cold and dark and stormy
I probably
night.
don't remember it in the way that you do, so go ahead.
The snowstorm of the century was bearing down on Washington, D.C. Now, I'm a House guy. I was home in Texas, but the Senate was there voting on, for cloture on the Affordable Care Act. And they were down to the 11th hour. Every senator had jet fume fever. They wanted out of there so bad. The snowstorm's going to lock them in for days. They'll be separated from their families. Let's just get it passed. We can come back and fix it in conference. You hear that from time to time. Well, it wasn't quite right, but let's just get it out and we'll come.
That's kind of like saying, don't worry, I'll change him after we're married.
Yeah,
it never actually happens.
Yeah, there you go.
Right, yeah.
So this thing passed on Christmas Eve with 60 votes, and it was a pretty dreadful spectacle. But then it never got to conference, and it never got to conference because it was such a dreadful spectacle that, for heaven's sakes, Massachusetts again elected a Republican in a special election a few weeks later. I mean, that hadn't happened since the earth cooled the first time. So you have a Republican in Massachusetts who is now that 60th vote that upon which Harry Reid depended to get this thing passed, and it's no longer there. And Harry Reid said, I've done everything I can do with the Affordable Care Act. It will not withstand another vote in the Senate. Rather than work with what you got and say, well, let's try to make these things better and get something passed that's actually good for people. He said, Nancy Pelosi, you've got to pass this thing through the House. She said, I can't do it. I haven't got 100 votes for this thing. But somehow over the next 3 months, remember it was March 21st when this thing finally passed, when enough people were promised or arms were broken or threats were made, and they got to the 218 votes that they needed. Remember, the Affordable Care Act is not the health care law that passed the House the first time. It was actually H.R. 3590. Yes, it had a House bill number, but H.R. 3590, if you do the research on Thomas and the Library of Congress site, it actually was a housing bill that passed in the House in July of 2009. It probably passed without any dissenting votes at that point. It went over to the Senate to await further action. The further action was, it was amended. Strike all after the enacting clause. That means they took all the housing words out of there, and insert, and they put in all the health care words. So when the Supreme Court comes back and says, well, it's really a tax law, and people say, wait, tax law has to originate in the House. Well, it did. It originated in the House. Technically, as a housing bill.
Right.
And then passed in the Senate, and really under pretty dreadful circumstances. But here's the deal. It was like saying the dog ate my homework, so I turned in my rough draft, and I still expected a good grade. This thing has never enjoyed popular support from the American people because, I mean, it is just full of mistakes. Look at the huge mistake that we're contemplating now in the state of Texas. Texas doesn't think they're going to set up a state exchange. Governor Perry has made some statements that would lead you to believe that he's not inclined to go in that direction. So what happens? Well, there's a fallback position in the Affordable Care Act. It's called a federal exchange. And the federal exchange can indeed be set up. It's administered through this small federal agency called the Office of Personnel Management. Nobody's ever heard of it, but it would be a very large federal agency in a few years because it would be the federal exchange. But the subsidies that exist for families that earn up to $90,000 a year to buy insurance, and this is how the president and his folks dealt with the cost of health care, was with a federal subsidy, which doesn't bring the cost of anything down. In fact, it may make it go in the other direction. But in a federal exchange, the way the law is written, there is no subsidy. The subsidies are available to state exchanges. Was that a drafting error? Was that just simply an oversight? Was it omission? Nobody knows. It's going to be tied up in the courts.
Kind of like an unfunded mandate.
Well, it's going to be tied up in the courts for years. But in the federal system, the subsidies may not exist.
Well, let me put you on the spot, because so it's obvious that you don't like this.
Like the first time.
Yeah, unlike the first time. So you don't like this. Well, it's my show.
I'll remember that.
Yeah, you don't like the bill. We understand that for your many reasons. So I'm tempted to ask you the question I occasionally get to ask politicians. I know what you are against. What are you for? So let's say this thing does go away. We still have the problem of X number of people uninsured in the state, X number of people uninsured in other states. We're here to contemplate the future of health care at this conference, and I think the future would be, first and foremost, what do we do if we don't like this? So tell me affirmatively what you would do instead.
So I've given you a list.
He did actually answer it on paper. He came prepared.
There you go. And this list is available for anyone who wants to look at it. I apologize I did not print off and bring this. I should have thought that through. I maintain a website, a health policy website called healthcaucus.org. It is not a political site. It's not a fundraising site. It is an extension of my representational work in Washington. To the best of my knowledge, I am the only member, Republican or Democrat, who runs a health policy website.
You have a 9-point plan, basically.
I have Dr. Burgess's prescriptions. This is what we should have done. This actually began when the Affordable Care Act was in genesis and being debated. Now, in the last Congress, I had a bill for every one of those points.
Right.
I have developed bills for most of those points that is actually out there and written in legislative form.
And some of them appear to be, at first glance, aspects of the Affordable Care Act.
Well,
parts of it are similar.
Okay. When the Affordable Care Act passed, one of the reasons that it was pushed was people with pre-existing conditions. And the president would say, we've got 8 to 12 million people with pre-existing conditions. I didn't know whether that was right or not, did you? Well, it wasn't. But I thought, oh, that's a pretty big problem that has to be dealt with. It turns out, again, this is a problem in the small group market and the individual market. It's not completely absent in the large group market, but because of open enrollment periods, it's not nearly the problem in the person who has employer-sponsored insurance with an AT&T or Verizon. That's not a problem in that part of the population. And how do we know this? Well, the president actually set up a federal pre-existing program. One had never existed before. States had pre-existing programs. Texas has a risk pool. The problem there is Texas never funds it to the level that is perhaps needed, but nevertheless, Texas has a risk pool. Now there's a federal risk pool. How many people are in the federal risk pool with this heavily subsidized high-risk insurance? When the Supreme Court ruled, I thought they were going to pull the rug out from under us. I mean, I really thought the Affordable Care Act was going down after I heard Justice Kennedy. And I spent the next 3 months really trying to get pieces of policy in place so that we wouldn't be clobbered because we weren't prepared for this when we all wanted it so badly. The pre-existing conditions, turns out there's 70, at the time the Supreme Court ruled, there were 62,000 people who were in this federal pre-existing program. So a very manageable population.
You think the magnitude of the problem is not what we've been told?
No, absolutely not. And so could you structure something to deal with, say, 100,000 people in a country of 310,000 people? Is it possible to construct something so that they don't fall through the cracks, but we don't have to disrupt everyone else's life in the process of doing that? And I would submit the answer to that question is yes. Now, we have an additional problem because the Affordable Care Act created this federal pool where it had never existed before. It would have been much easier, instead of setting up the federal pool to provide a subsidy to states who do have risk pools or reinsurance, provide some direct federal help to allow them to cover their residents who need to be covered. There's still 10 or 15 states who don't have any sort of program. Could they expand their Medicaid program to take in those individuals? Yes, that is possible. Could they take those individuals perhaps into their state insurance? Yes, that is possible. There was something you could have done for that finite segment of the population. Now, my side didn't want to deal with it. They said, well, We're not. It's Obamacare, and we're not going to do anything that looks like that. But at the same time, I recognize that if you pull the rug up from everyone, under everyone, with a Supreme Court ruling, and you've got 70,000 people who are in a federal program that now no longer exists, you will have, let's see, I could do the math at one point. I think it was 3.5 people every hour on MSNBC between June the 30th and November 6th. And it would probably just about work. We would hear from every one of those 70,000 people.
Right.
Because everyone has a compelling story. And it's not to say that just because the population is finite, it can be ignored. No, it cannot. But it can also be managed. And this was an area where I think we lost a big opportunity. I'm trying to get that back with the legislation you see referenced on here.
What website, where can people go for this?
Healthcaucus.org.
Caucus.org.
And it's under the issues tab.
Let me ask you about let me transition over to a related but separate topic, which is Medicare, which has obviously occupied a much larger percentage of the airtime during this presidential campaign, largely thanks to Congressman Ryan's place on the Republican ticket than we anticipated. We have competing scenarios on Medicare. The president's plan is often criticized by the Republicans because it cuts about $716 billion from provider payments. Basically, it's provider payments.
Right,
and there's a concern that if you cut provider payments, that the number of people who are willing to take Medicare patients will decline and the system will collapse. On the other side, you have the Romney-Ryan plan, which is largely what they call a premium support plan. That's the semantics for
premium support.
a voucher.
No, it's premium support.
Well, but the Kaiser Foundation, this week put out a report that said that contrary to what Romney and Ryan have been telling everybody, whether you call it premium support or vouchers, the costs to seniors enrolled in the Medicare program are going to go up between sort of astronomically and unbelievably astronomically if this plan is put into effect. So it seems as if we have two unlikable programs.
The Kaiser is heavily invested in the Affordable Care Act, so of course they're going to put
the Kaiser people are skewed, as they say.
But look.
Is that right? You think the Kaiser people are not telling
you
the
truth? What is the advantage for having a premium support system? Medicare right now takes care of everybody the same way. And I've heard in a group of doctors not a few weeks ago, the hardest person in the world to take care of in Dallas, Texas is Ross Perot, because he wants everything the way he wants it, and you can only charge him a standard Medicare rate. You can't charge him extra because he's Ross Perot.
We need means testing.
We're not allowed to use the words means and testing together in a sentence. However, in 2000... Is
that a Lyceum rule that I wasn't told?
No, it's a congressional rule.
Okay,
all right. In 2003, in the Medicare Modernization Act, the concept of income relating the Part B premium was introduced. And that is means testing by another name, because you take people who are at upper income levels and charge them a higher Part B premium than people who are at the lowest income levels, and it makes some sense. Under a premium support system, and Paul Ryan, of course, can do this much more eloquently than I can, but you don't have the same subsidy available to everyone. You do, in fact, differentiate at income levels, and such that the people who are at the lowest ends of the income scale receive enough of a subsidy to get them exactly what they would have had in traditional Medicare. If they want to shop around and, with the premium support, if they want, it's a request for proposals from insurance companies, match what we're doing with individual Medicare, and here's the subsidy that's available. And for that person at the lowest end of the economic scale, there would be no difference between what they see today and what they saw in a premium support system. Ross Perot might be in a different world, though.
So you dispute the general sense that that sort of a premium support program would result in just a massive increase?
Oh, absolutely. Look, there's 10,000 of me a day that are aging into the Medicare system. You can't.
In fact, so the numbers are 48 million people enrolled in Medicare today, going up to, I think, 73 million in 2030. The cost is going to go from something like 532 billion to 923 billion. It's growing astronomically.
Yeah, can I just see a show of hands of the doctors that are in the room? Do you really believe that we can control those costs by that expansion of the population, depending on the program, by cutting your payments? I mean, does that work? Is there any arithmetic model that makes that tenable? And the answer is no, there's not. That's why the approach taken by the
problem with that.
Yes, if your only tool is cutting provider payments, you're never going to get there. And what do we do as providers? Our costs are fixed. We see Medicare patients in our office, and you're telling us we're going to get a little less, or in some cases a lot less for everyone we see. What is the normal human reaction to that when my light bill is going up, my nurse costs are going up, my rent is going up. What am I going to do? I'm going to see a lot more Medicare patients if that's all I've got. And as a consequence, the cost to the system only increases. We've come at this exactly the wrong way at so many levels, not just in the Affordable Care Act, but for years with administrative pricing and sustainable growth rate formulas. Everything we've done has actually made the problem worse. And I say we, I mean the federal government. I haven't been there the whole time. So I don't want to take complete responsibility for the debacle we see in front of us, but that is the problem. Cutting provider payments, yeah, it'll take you only so far. The $716 billion includes cuts to Medicare Advantage, so that's a cut on the insurance end. Some of the cuts to hospitals. Home health takes about a $60 to $70 billion whack over 10 years. The Independent Payment Advisory Board adds another 15 or $20 billion. And then, of course, in the sequester that starts January 2nd, physicians are going to take another 2% cut. The other part of the cuts to providers is the sustainable growth rate formula. That is a $280 to $316 billion cut to physician payments that is baked in the cake. When the Congressional Budget Office calculates how much this thing costs, they by law they have to go by existing law. And existing law says Medicare rates get cut by about 30% on January 1st. So the Congressional Budget Office can't say, well, Congress always comes in and fixes that, so we won't count it. No, they have to count it. That's their job. And then there's another 2% on top of that that's in the sequester. So this is an enormous problem, and cutting provider payments is just never going to get you there.
Back away from Medicare and let's go to Medicaid for a second. Another aspect of the Affordable Care Act here in Texas.
Back away from the fiscal cliff.
Well, yes, for the moment, please do that. We have made the decision as a state, by which I mean our governor, who we elected, has made a decision. Don't laugh, whoever didn't vote for the governor. Don't laugh. Be nice. To not take advantage of the opportunity to expand Medicaid. There are a lot of people who say if you don't expand Medicaid, you are asking for trouble given the population of the uninsured in this state. But the governor believes that expanding Medicaid, and others in the state government believe that expanding Medicaid would be a mistake because it would be accepting federal money that would be for a finite period of time. We'd bear an enormous amount of cost beyond that if we had to continue the things that we were offering to people. And they just think that it's a terrible idea. What's your sense of the Medicaid program and what the state or a state like Texas should be obligated to do?
Well, and I'll be the first one to say I'm not always on the same page with the governor, but I think in this case he is right. The fact that it's a bait and switch, you get free money for 2 years, and then some almost free money for another year or two after that. But look at the problems we're having in Medicare today. Look at the problems we're having in Medicaid today. What is the projected unfunded liability? We got our Federal Reserve folks here. The projected unfunded liability in Medicaid, just Medicaid. President Fisher of the Dallas Fed told me the other day was $70 billion over the next 75 years. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. Why in the world would we do anything that makes that worse? And yet that is what you say, okay, well, it's 100% free money to the state. I mean, it's coming from the federal government, which means we're borrowing a lot of it from somewhere else. But why wouldn't the state take that money? Because at some point, and at some point in the very near future, I mean, 3 years is a heartbeat in public policy, it runs out. And when it runs out, what happens then? You have expanded your roles phenomenally. There will be requirements for maintenance of effort. That is, a state will be required under federal guidelines. I mean, it's not written into law anywhere right now, but I guarantee you it would be there somewhere. Look at even the additional Medicaid money that was made available in the stimulus bill. And I thought that was a phenomenally bad idea because in February of 2009, you passed 18 months of increased Medicaid reimbursements to states, and then it stops. Well, wait a minute. That's September of 2010. That's 2 months before an election. Congress isn't going to stop the money then. So they continued it, but they required the states. They produced what was called a maintenance of effort agreement that states could not begin to drop people off their Medicaid rolls because they feared that that's what was going to happen. There will be a similar structure that's built into whatever happens in the future. The federal government has been such an unreliable fiscal partner. Ask any doctor in the room. That I do not quarrel at all with Governor Perry saying, wait a minute, I'm going to be circumspect about this offer. it looks a little too good to be true, and I'm going to study it before I accept it. I think that's a prudent approach, and I think he's correct.
You know, if you add up everything you've said so far, it's reasonable to ask whether the problem you have is less with the specifics of the Affordable Care Act or Medicare or Medicaid than at a level above whether you think it's necessary for us to relitigate the social contract. You know, President Johnson was the architect of this big social contract that essentially said the federal government's going to work its hardest to implement programs that will take care of people in need, people who can't take care of themselves. And this political cycle, this conversation, not just ours, but the version of this conversation happening all over the state and all over the country, seems to ask the question of whether the social contract has run out its string. Do you have a problem philosophically with the idea that we have an obligation to take care of people in need at the federal level, or is that just no longer the case?
I'm not sure how you've asked the question, but the answer is no. I think a social safety net is still a valuable aspect of what both state and federal governments can provide. But honestly, I mean, this is a room full of entrepreneurs and scientists and doctors. When Medicare was envisioned and Medicaid right on its heels in 1965, and I used to tease my dad, who was a surgeon in practice at the time. I said, when Medicare and Medicaid were developed, you had two drugs, penicillin and cortisone, and they were interchangeable. Yeah, and he didn't think it was that funny either, Evan. But you know, the world has changed so much, and so here we have the biggest thinkers in the country, and we're going to redo healthcare in this country from soup to nuts. And it's Medicaid? Are you kidding me? That's the best we can do? Even allowing the governors to have the flexibility with a block grant system, or maybe even a per member per month type payment. Look at the money that goes into things it was never intended to go and doesn't help a single poor person anywhere. Medicaid is used as an economic development tool in some areas of the country. Driving here from the airport tonight, how many dental clinics did I see that said we accept Medicaid in Spanish on the front window? Well, wait a minute. Medicaid only pays a very small... Texas must have the worst teeth ever in the history of man, because we have spent more money...
Somebody tweet that.
We have spent more money in Medicaid in Texas over the last 3 or 4 years than has ever been spent. And you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? Well, it happens because the federal government has an uncomfortable habit of shoving money out the door at problems. People are happy enough to lap it up,
right,
and they don't help people. And that is the real difficulty. Look, okay, we had a big hearing, and I'll never forget, this was the day Lehman Brothers fell. Remember that in September?
September 15th of 2008. I think we all remember that day well.
Maybe it was 2 or 3 days after that. We were in the big hearing room in Energy and Commerce, the big room with the big blue drapes and the blue carpet on the floor. And we had this panel in front of us. It just went on forever. We had people from HSAs. We had Elizabeth Edwards. We had Karen Davis from the Commonwealth Foundation, and this big group of high-powered thinkers. We didn't have any doctors. Oh, anyway, we had this big group of high-powered thinkers that were going to tell us how healthcare reform what it ought to look like. And someone asked the question, and I thought it was a legitimate question. I keep hearing cost estimates that seem to be all over the place. Can you nail it down for us a little bit? And one fellow, Dr. Stephen Parenti from, I think it was the University of Minnesota, said, well, the range is between $60 billion a year to $800 billion a year. So in a normal 10-year budget cycle, that's between $600 billion for 10 years to, I think, $8 trillion for 10 years. And the fellow that asked the question said, well, wait a minute, that's just, that's too big a variation. Why is it like that? He said, well, if you just took the least amount you could do to cover the uninsured in this country, that would be Medicaid, and that would cost you about $60 billion a year. If you did the full benefits package of something like the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan and gave everybody the option of a PPO, an HMO, whatever they would want, and subsidized it like employer-sponsored insurance, that would cost $800 billion a year. Just doing the numbers of, I think at the time, 47 million uninsured plus whatever the per year cost was for the FEHBP at the time. So that was the range of cost. What did we end up with? We ended up with a projection of $600 billion for that part of the Affordable Care Act. In other words, there was never any intention to provide anything more than Medicaid. But again, remember, Medicaid is a 40-year-old program that requires, I don't remember, 1,800 waivers in order to work. It works differently in every state. It is just, why would you do that? Is that really if you're the cream of the crop of social thinkers and you're going to provide the best social safety net anyone's ever imagined, and you're going to spend a ton of money to do it, it's Medicaid? It's the best you can do?
All right, so you're depressing me.
Thank you. It's my job.
And before we open up to questions from the audience, I want to ask you to tell me something positive and upbeat that I can take away from this, because everything I've heard so far has just made me so profoundly depressed about the state of healthcare. Surely, from your vantage point, you've got something positive that you can say as we look out over the horizon, or out toward the horizon, about where we're headed.
Well, really, just looking out over the room, I try to meet with all of the young physicians who come to Washington every year to do various fellowships in various locations, and we sit around one of the big tables in the members' dining room, and I spring for breakfast. And one morning, it was really just a couple of months after the Affordable Care Act passed, and one of the youngsters asked me, well, gee, Dr. Burgess, I bet you wouldn't go into medicine today if you knew all this stuff was coming. And I said, on the contrary, I would go into medicine in a heartbeat. You guys, this next generation of doctors is going to have the ability to alleviate human suffering on a scale that no doctor has ever known at any time. And we are truly on the golden age. And again, you all in this room.
Why? Is it technology?
It is the promise of the policy is going to be dreadful, but the science is going to be spectacular.
Science is going to be helpful.
And the advancing complexity of what we're able to do, the rapidity with which new information gets out there and gets put into use, even in spite of the federal regulatory agencies, it is a grand new world that these young doctors, these young men and women are going into. So yeah, if I could move myself back in time to be right on the cusp of getting out of where I was 35 years ago and start all over again, I would do it in a minute, because the world that they're going to be in is going to be one that's again, no generation of doctors has ever had these things at their disposal. This is Buck Rogers stuff that, can you imagine when I was in medical school? It was 35 years ago, right now in this town, this city, when we talked about computers in medicine, that meant we all went in this room and had to learn how to program a computer. Can you imagine anything more worthless than a bunch of medical students programming a computer? You know what you got. Computers that knew every bad word in the English language and can spit them out with great rapidity, even for those old machines. But you fast forward to where we are now, and the promise of electronic health records, the promise of the rapid learning environment that we're in, that computer science has the marriage of computer science with medical science, it's truly fantastic. And the pace with which the amount of knowledge grows, the amount of knowledge doubles, has really, the past several years has just been increasing at a phenomenal rate. I mean, you can go on the internet now and send a few bucks off and have your genome sequenced. I mean, that's extremely powerful. If someone had told me that when I was in medical school, well, I wouldn't have known what they were talking about because Al Gore hadn't invented the internet. But still, it's a very powerful concept that we're putting that kind of power into the hands of patients, not just their doctors, into the hands of their patients as well. Again, there's plenty of things we can do to foul it up, case in point, but I'm very optimistic about the future because the young men and women that I meet that are going in are truly, they're just as passionate as they were 35 years ago. Perhaps they're even a little more focused because it costs them a little more money than it did me.
Right.
And they've got big loans that they've got to pay, but they are focused on making this work. So I feel very positive about the future of healthcare in this country. We've been the leader in the world really since the Second World War. We will continue that position through the better part of this century.
Okay. Well, that was upbeat, wasn't it? All right.
Because of us, it's because of you.
All right. Well, good. I like that.
Yes, the answer to your question is yes, there is the conversation. In fact, I think people have been having it around the state. I don't know if that's the correct way to go. And I don't know at the end of the day if things are going to happen. There is an election coming up on November 6th, and things will happen as a consequence. That election will have consequences. Let's war game it out for just a minute. We've already talked about Governor Romney. If he's successful, he's committed to undoing parts of this, and I would submit to you that he can. do that with just a simple majority in the Senate, because so much of this was fixed.
It would be through reconciliation.
So much of this was fixed when it first passed under reconciliation, so the budgetary aspects, some of the cost aspects can be changed through a 50-vote margin in the Senate. And then obviously the president would sign it.
But what if the president's reelected? Which at this point, let's be honest, it's a coin flip.
It is.
We don't know what's going to happen.
The president's reelected and the Senate stays essentially the same. And this is I tell you, this is one of my biggest fears. A status quo election really is.
It could very well be a status quo election where you guys control the House, Democrats have the majority in the Senate by a couple seats, and the president is reelected narrowly.
And it makes it tough. And it took me probably 8 months this year to get a phone call answered down at the White House. And the fellow finally came out and he said, you know, we just really don't have much to talk about. You're pretty mean to us in committee and during the hearings, and we don't like you. And I said, I don't like you, and there's an election coming up, and we're just going to.
And you wonder why people are cynical about government.
But.
Sounds like high school with better food is what it sounds like to me. I mean, isn't it? I mean, can you understand how we might perceive this to be a little difficult to take?
But you haven't let me finish the
sorry,
story.
Go ahead. Okay. The media is worse. I agree. So go ahead. Okay.
So this fellow is the congressional liaison. I mean, this is the White House's guy in the House. And it took me 8 months to have a word with him. I said, I accept the fact that we're on different pages through the election, and we will not talk again until after the election. I said, but if you successfully prosecute your argument and the president is reelected for a second term, we have to talk. And he said, well, that might be good. I said, we have to talk because this thing doesn't work. It doesn't work on so many levels. We haven't talked a lot about the fiscal cliff. Let me just talk to you a little bit about the cost aspects. And people will argue back and forth about does it cost $1 trillion or $3 trillion over the next 10 years. Fact is, it costs a lot of money. And there is not a lot of money to be had. So you had this big fight in August of 2011 called the Budget Control Act. It was the debt limit expansion. And if you read Bob Woodward's book, you can go into great detail, gory detail, of what that was like. But after the Budget Control Act, Speaker Boehner said at the start, he went to the Economic Club in New York, made a speech, said for every dollar we increase the debt limit, I got to have $1 in cut. So it's got to be a one-to-one transfer. That's where the sequester came from. Hasn't kicked in yet. There's some discussion as to whether or not Congress will lose its nerve and repeal the sequester. But nevertheless, that's where the sequester came from. And it hasn't kicked in yet. There's going to be another debt limit. I can't tell you when, but it might be December, it might be January, it might be February. It probably does depend on what happens in the election. Secretary Geithner will move heaven and earth to keep it from happening before Election Day, but it's going to come up after Election Day at some point. So you got to presume the Speaker Boehner will be the Speaker of the House when this new debt limit discussion happens. Is he going to feel any differently about $1 in cuts for every dollar of increase in the debt limit? I mean, I don't know what his official position will be on that, but I rather expect it will be at least that. So where are you going to get that money? We've already whacked the Department of Defense and the sequester and regular appropriations. We've already waxed Health and Human Services. They get a 7 to 8% across the board cut in discretionary funding. So that means FDA, NIH, all of those departments within Health and Human Services are going to get a big cut on January 2nd. Can you take more money from them? I guess, but it's going to be tough. So where are you going to go to get a big pile of money? And it's the Affordable Care Act. My objection to Simpson-Bowles when it came out was that they did not harm a hair on the head of the Affordable Care Act. And if you say we've got this big debt commission, we put together a plan for dealing with the nation's deficit into the future and all of the unfunded liabilities in Medicare and Medicaid, and yet you fail to tackle those liabilities that haven't even started yet, then you're not being serious about trying to control the deficit. My suspicion is that if there is a debt limit discussion, and I think there will be, I think there will have to be cuts out of the Affordable Care Act.
Comes right back into play.
So what does that mean? That means delaying the subsidies or delaying the implementation beyond 2014, reducing the subsidies from 400% of the federal poverty level to 200%, lowering the amount of Medicaid expansion. I don't know what that will look like, but there will have to be some adjustment. Just my opinion. I'm not speaking for the conference or my party or the speaker, but just my observation of what has gone on previously.
Congressman, thank you very much for
Thank you,
everything you did. Thank you.